Did the CIA truly attempt to undermine Fidel Castro by targeting his beard? Welcome everyone to Opentiera. Today, as we explore Cuba, uncovering its captivating history, diverse culture, and the fascinating quirks that define this beautiful country, there's an intriguing tale that adds a surprising twist to its narrative. Amidst its vibrant past, there's a curious chapter involving over 600 assassination attempts on former leaders and, yes, even alleged plans aimed at Castro's iconic beard. Stay tuned to dive deeper into this captivating story about Cuba and its journey through history. Cuba is an island country located in the northern Caribbean Sea, just south of Florida, in the United States and east of Mexico. It is the largest country by land area in the Caribbean at over 42,000 square miles. To put its size in perspective, Cuba's area is similar to the US state of Pennsylvania. The island of Cuba itself is over 600 miles long, while its width varies between 30 to 100 miles at different areas along its length. Cuba is characterized by generally flat to rolling terrain, with more rugged landscape in the southeastern portion of the island. Cuba's coastline spans approximately 2,254 miles, with no point on the island being more than 30 miles from shore. There are extensive harbors and bays housing Cuba's many port facilities, especially Havana Harbor on the western coast, which hosts the capital city, Havana. Beyond its idyllic natural landscapes, Cuba charms with vibrant colonial-era cities like Havana, the Caribbean's largest metropolis and Cuba's energetic capital. Though small by urban standards, provincial cities like Santiago de Cuba and Camagüey overflow with Cuban culture, cuisine, and hospitality. Cuba was inhabited by various indigenous peoples before the arrival of the Spanish in 1492, led by Christopher Columbus. After he claimed Cuba in 1492, the Spanish began colonizing the island over the next decades, leading to the genocide and assimilation of the indigenous Siboney and Guanahatabey people. By 1550, the indigenous populations had largely vanished due to disease and brutal working conditions under Spanish occupation. Spain imported large numbers of African slaves to work Cuba's sprawling tobacco and sugar plantations, fueling the island's agricultural export economy in the 1800s, centered in bustling Port Havana. Vast wealth concentrated among Spanish officials and elite white Cuban landowners rested upon the slave labor of Africans who even post-emancipation remained disenfranchised. Reforms enabling freer trade brought further growth, still benefiting the privileged classes. However, late 1800s Cuban poets and writers revived nationalist sentiments, with José Martí eventually spearheading the independence struggle until Spain relinquished control after the 1898 Spanish-American War. Political instability, economic disparity, and corruption under a series of leaders culminated in the Cuban Revolution in 1959, led by Fidel Castro, overthrowing the existing government. Castro consolidated power rapidly after seizing control by suppressing opposition, censoring media, nationalizing private industries, and centralizing authority under his command and the Communist Party governance structure. Tight control of the economy led to declines in productivity and extreme shortages of consumer goods. The US, in turn, imposed strict economic sanctions over decades in protest over Cuba's alignment with the Soviet Union, seizure of American assets after the revolution, and other human rights violations under Castro's rule. Fidel Castro's authoritarian grip on Cuba was challenged various times, including by assassination attempts, as his revolutionary regime made enemies both internally and abroad. One actual attempt came from CIA-recruited Cuban exiles in the 1960s, plotting to hide poison capsules in a ballpoint pen used by Castro during an interview. However, the pen failed to discharge properly when Castro repeatedly clicked it while gesticulating. There were also more fanciful, unconfirmed plots targeting Castro, like the alleged CIA scheme to sneak thallium salt chemicals into his boots to make his famous beard fall out from absorption through the skin. The goal was to embarrass Castro by removing his trademark facial hair, but the Cuban double agent meant to supply the chemicals backed out. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans sought to flee the country under Castro's increasingly repressive communist regime and strained economy, risking dangerous journeys, often assisted by Cuban-American groups opposed to Castro's governance. Discontent festered among the domestic population over low living standards. Castro managed to fend off internal revolution attempts and outlast Cold War tensions into the 2000s, in part via brutal crackdowns by Cuba's intelligence services and military. Strict restrictions were placed on political dissent and organizing opposition movements, with mass imprisonment. Though some have argued Cuba's high literacy, healthcare access and social services buffered wider unrest. While lauded in some circles internationally as an iconic revolutionary figure against Western imperialism, Castro's human rights record, political repression, and economic policy missteps left a complex legacy both within Cuba and abroad, the impact of which continues to resonate after his retirement and 2016 death, during a gradual opening in US-Cuban relations in his final years. Cuba is a multi-ethnic nation with interwoven cultural influences. The World Bank estimates that its population currently stands at around 11 million. Ethnically, approximately 64% of Cubans identify as white, 27% as mixed race, and 9% as Afro-Cuban or black. Many Cubans have ancestry combining Spanish, African, and indigenous roots in varying proportions. Immigration also brought ethnic influences from China, Europe, and elsewhere. The primary language spoken in Cuba is Spanish. Cuban Spanish dialect has incorporated indigenous, African, and non-Castilian terminology. Many Afro-Cubans preserved West African languages for centuries. English and Haitian Creole are also spoken by small minority populations. Religiously, about 60% of Cubans identify as Christian. Some West African belief systems, like Santeria, fused with Catholicism during slavery. Around 23% identify as irreligious, and the remainder associate with other religions. Cuba has a socialist planned economy directed by the Communist Party. The World Bank estimates that its total GDP is around $107 billion. The Cuban government also employs state-operated companies that generate over 70% of the GDP. Key economic sectors include tourism, nickel mining, tobacco, pharmaceuticals, and agriculture. Sugar production also formerly played a huge role economically. Following independence in 1902, Cuba saw economic expansion and modernization, fueled by substantial US investments. However, these gains concentrated in the hands of a small, privileged class, while rural poverty persisted. Corruption and repression ultimately sparked political unrest. After Fidel Castro's 1959 communist revolution, his regime reduced US economic influence, instead receiving Soviet aid and building up state agriculture and industry. But Cuba later faced a severe economic crisis in the 1990s post-Soviet collapse, suffering consumer goods shortages, industrial decline and recession during the troubled special period. Reforms included allowing some small private businesses in the 2000s to recover. US sanctions also continue hindering external trade and access to finance. But Cuba may hold promise, unlocking greater prosperity over the long run via market liberalization, international cooperation, sustained investments, and utilizing its educated population. Cuba's geographical position has heavily influenced its politics and foreign relations, owing to the country's proximity to the United States, location within the Caribbean region, and former alliance with the Soviet Union. Cuba's proximity to the US made it strategically valuable initially to Spain and later to American corporate interests in the early 20th century, spurring investments in its agriculture and mining. However, Fidel Castro's 1959 socialist revolution and ties with the USSR positioned Cuba as a Cold War geopolitical threat, triggering US sanctions and regional tensions for decades. Though Cuba's global importance lessened post-Cold War, consecutive American administrations maintained a hostile stance, hampering Cuba's international economic integration. Today, with Cuba gradually shifting away from hardline communism under new leadership, while the US also eases away from past policies, there may be opportunities for Cuba to realign politically and economically with global partners to develop its potential over the coming decades. Cuba's musical heritage mixes Spanish guitar and African percussion into passionate rhythms that ignite Cuban dance floors and those around the globe. Legendary performers like Benny Moré popularized Cuba's mambo craze. Jazz giants such as Chucho Valdés infuse bebop with Afro-Cuban flair. Buena Vista Social Club brought traditional trova genres to new fans. Now salsa, son, and rumba pump life into clubs worldwide. Cuban visual arts beautifully capture deeper cultural identity. Wilfredo Lam merged surrealism and Afro-Caribbean spiritualism into stunning works. Later generations like Manuel Mendive reclaimed Santeria motifs and themes of liberation. For literature, Alejo Carpentier pioneered magical realism, merging lush prose with folkloric imagination. Author José Lezama. Lima's Baroque writing interlaced European form with Caribbean color. Poet Nicolás Guillén drew global acclaim, combining classical Spanish verse with rhythms from son music to proudly highlight Afro-Cuban roots. Cuban cuisine blends native Caribbean, Spanish, African, and Latin American influences into a delicious and unique fusion cuisine. Here are some of the dishes that capture the essence of Cuban cuisine. Vaca frita. Meaning fried cow, vaca frita features shredded and fried flank steak as the star of the show. It's served alongside more classic Cuban side dishes like rice and beans. Picadillo. This hearty hash of ground beef, tomatoes, onions, olives, and raisins likely originated from Spain, but transformed over time in Cuban kitchens. It's delicious stuffed into wraps or tacos too. Medianoche sandwich. Its name means midnight. This popular Cuban sandwich stacks ham, roast pork, Swiss cheese, and pickles on sweet egg dough bread. A go-to post-party snack, ropa vieja. Considered the national dish, this iconic shredded beef stew simmers away with tomatoes, peppers, and onions into the ultimate comforting meal. These are some of the top dishes that define the flavors of Cuban cuisine, from ropa vieja stew to medianoche sandwiches. What Cuban dish are you most excited to try? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video on Cuba, you'll love this next one.